Good morning, everyone. Please turn with me to Leviticus chapter 11. That's book of Leviticus chapter 11. All right, so we are starting a two-part series, and today is part one of clean and unclean regulations in the Old Testament. And next week will be part two, and Tim Nichols will be preaching on chapter 12 through 15. And I'll be kind of doing the introduction to the whole topic on the first half of the sermon, and the second half of the sermon talking about chapter 11 and the dietary regulation. Tim gets to preach about bodily discharge in chapter 15, and I'm a little jealous, but I get to talk about food, which is probably why they give it to me, because I love talking about food. But I'm going to talk about something a little bit more unappetizing as our intro, because thinking about clean and unclean, as a nurse, I naturally think about infection. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about the coronavirus. I'm already sick of it. It's like all over the news, like I don't want to, no pun intended. But I'm going to talk about a different infection that's much more interesting and actually more contagious. It's called Clostridium difficile, affectionately called C. diff by healthcare providers. C. diff is a very contagious GI infection that results in diarrhea and colitis. And approximately 500,000 people are infected every year. $4.8 billion go into healthcare costs annually because of C. diff in the hospital. And about 29,000 people die every year from C. diff. It's a hospital-acquired infection, and it's pretty serious. And it's super contagious because it can live as spores outside your body on surfaces up to 6 months. Right? So think about how much you have to clean to stay ahead of this. And as nurses, it's something we have to constantly think about because those patients are in contact isolation, meaning you can't touch them. Right? They have to be isolated. So I have to wear a gown and a glove every time I go into a C. diff precaution room. Right? So you may have seen this if you've ever been to a hospital. You have a gown, right? And people wear this gown, nurses, and other people who are visiting have to wear this gown before you enter a C. diff room. And then you got to put on the gloves, and you have to be pretty aware of what you're touching, right? Because as a nurse, when I'm in the room, I think primarily about what is contaminated and what is not contaminated. Okay, it changes my perspective of everything in the room. Okay, what am I seeing, and how is this changing my view? Now, I can't put all this on and all of a sudden scratch my nose, right? I mean, and it happens all the time. It happens every time you're in the room. You're like, oh, I really want to scratch my nose. and you can't because you have to be aware of what you're touching, and everything is very clearly delineated as contaminated and uncontaminated. And what if your nurse comes out of the room of the C. diff patient and they start to shake your hand? How would you feel if they want to touch you or touch your hair? Squeeze their cheeks. You wouldn't feel very good about that, would you? Because you want this isolation. You want this clear line between contamination and the uncontaminated. And that's kind of how the Jewish view of the clean and the unclean worked. Okay? It affected every aspect of your life. And it was pretty dramatic that as an Israelite and as a Jewish person who followed these regulations, you really view the world as clean and unclean. From the food that you eat all the way to the person you touch. It affected every aspect of your life. So it affected many areas, including food and dietary laws that we see in chapter 11, and childbirth in chapter 12, and skin diseases in chapter 13. And it actually covers 7 different skin diseases, not just leprosy. And 14 actually talks about household mold that you might have in your house. And chapter 15, multiple different kind of bodily discharges. So it's really interesting how it affects every aspect of your life, and they all have something to do with your body, right? It's something that goes into your body or comes out of your body, and depending on what that is, it can make you unclean. And they also have a pretty strong symbolism of life and death, right? Some of this obviously represents life, and some of them represents death, depending on what that is. So why was it such a big deal? Why was this such a big deal to the Israelites and to the Pharisees? When you read the New Testament, they're always freaking out about these laws. So what are the consequences of these? Yeah, so consequence of uncleanness means you cannot enter the tabernacle or the tent of the meeting. Okay? Defiling the tabernacle results in death, right? And we saw that in last week in chapter 10 with Nadab and Abihu, that they broke the rules and they defiled the temple, and they actually died instantly. So the result is that you can't worship, right? So chapter 15:31, thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness, by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. Yeah, the next consequence is that uncleanness could result in isolation from community and living outside the camp. Okay? Meaning there's a loss of fellowship with God and fellowship with others. And you see that with the leprosy. In 13:45, it says, the leprous person who has a disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose. And he shall cover his upper lips and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean, he shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So imagine this complete isolation, that you're living on your own, away from community, cut off from the fellowship of others, and with fellowship from God. Okay? That is a consequence of uncleanness. So imagine if this applied to us today. What would that look like if we had to follow these regulations as Christians? What if you're having brunch this morning before church? And I know that you come to first service, so that's not possible. But if you go to second service, maybe you went to brunch and you got some omelet with some friends. What if there's bacon in there? And you didn't know you ordered bacon in your omelet. But now you're unclean. So now you actually can't come to church. Can you imagine that? And some of the skin diseases actually cover eczema. So, I have eczema. What if I wake up one morning and I have really severe eczema and some discharge on my skin? Well, I actually can't come to church. Can you imagine following these regulations? What if you're bleeding? What if it's that time of the month? Okay? What if you had a baby recently? All these regulations actually prevent you from fellowship with God and fellowship with other people. So even every meal that you have, to the market you go to, where you buy your meat, to every handshake, okay? Because some people were considered unclean. You would have to think about, who am I touching right now? And are they clean or unclean? Okay? And even as a nurse, if I touch a dead body, I can't come to worship God. I cannot come into the presence of God. Okay? It changes the way you view the world. So how does the clean and the unclean regulation impact our understanding of the Bible? I'm not sure about you, but as we study the Leviticus together as a church, it has really impacted the way I read the Bible. Almost like reading the Bible in 4K clarity. So I don't have a TV at home, but my sister has a 4K television. And every time I go over to the house, I'm always amazed every time how clear it is. Like you can see the moles on people's faces. Like, wow, that's clear. And that's kind of how I feel when I read the New Testament and the Old Testament with the perspective of Leviticus in mind. And I see and understand so much more the significance of these laws. Okay, think about the story of the Good Samaritan. That the fact that Levites and the priests passed them by because touching a dead person would make you unclean. Touching a Samaritan would make you unclean as well. Think about the woman at the well, the fact that she was surprised that Jesus would talk to her, would take a cup of water from her, because she was considered unclean. Think about Jesus touching the leper, and how much that shocked everyone when he touched a leper who is isolated and ostracized from the community. Okay? Jesus healing the dead girl and touching her, all these things makes a lot of sense, right? And the Pharisees are always freaking out. And you kind of empathize with the Pharisees now. I always said they were just being uptight and anal. But you read these laws and you understand, no, this was their way of life. This was ingrained as part of their culture. And that's why the Pharisees made such a big deal about it. And I think part of my struggle has been that I always have traditionally read Leviticus as a manual, as simply as a book of law, almost like an IKEA manual. And I'm terrible at building IKEA furnitures because I'm so bad at reading manuals. And I'm a typical guy, I just don't like to read manuals. And it doesn't work out very well. So if you read Leviticus as a book of the law and simply as a manual, it's all going to fly right over you. You're going to miss so much. And when I realized, studying through the Leviticus, is that it's actually not a manual. It's a storyline. It's a narrative. Okay? There's a story of a bigger picture that God is painting here of what God is doing for the Israelites. And if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it makes a lot more sense. And if Leviticus was a movie, it's a sequel to Exodus. And once you realize that, it makes so much more sense. So let's take a bigger picture and think about kind of the big picture and zoom out. Then start in Genesis, right? Remember that when God created Adam and Eve and created the Garden of Eden, it was perfect. And God walked with Adam, right? He was in the presence of human beings, and God fellowshiped with mankind. But as a result of the fall and sin, we've been banished east of Eden. And fast forward, Abraham has chosen to be the people of God, and his descendants will be the people of God. But what happens is that they are exiled into Egypt, and they become slaves in Egypt. So you have the whole book of Exodus where God has this great rescue of delivering Israelites from the slavery from Pharaoh. But what happens at the end? There's this question at the end of Exodus when people are now in the wilderness, they build a tabernacle, and the presence of God is with them. But Moses can't enter. And the question becomes, can a man enter the presence of God? And if so, how? How do you enter the presence of God? And that's what Leviticus is all about. It's all about how do you enter the presence of God and have this holy space, and what do you do with it? How do you approach the holy and perfect God? So this clean and unclean laws are either drawing you closer to the Lord or away from the Lord, okay? And it's the way you approach God. And remember, the first 7 chapters of Leviticus talked a lot about offerings. And all those offerings helped you atone for your sins and get closer to the Lord, to the tabernacle. And in chapter 8 and 9, you talk a lot about the priesthood and how the priests were anointed and what their roles were in the sacrifice. But chapter 10, there's a problem. There's a conflict in the story where Nadab and Abihu, they kind of drop the ball, right? They bring this strange, funky fire into the tabernacle, and they end up defiling it. Okay? We don't know what it was, but they end up defiling the temple, and now there's a need to cleanse the temple. And God directly speaks to Aaron for the first time. Okay? The entire book of Leviticus, God's always talking to Moses, and Moses to Aaron. And all of a sudden, for the first time, God speaks directly to Aaron and says, drink no wine or strong drink, you or your sons with you, when you go into the tent of the meeting, lest you die. It should be a statute forever throughout your generation. You're to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. So chapter 11 to 15 is all about that. It's all about distinguishing between the holy and the common. And why are we learning about this? It's because of the sins of Nadab and Abihu, because they defiled the tabernacle. And it's interesting here that if Leviticus was a movie, that there's a change in scenery. Chapter 1 through 9 was all about the offering and the priesthood. It was all filmed inside the tabernacle. Okay? But starting chapter 11, you're outside the tabernacle going into the camp. And you're filming the everyday life of people and how these clean and unclean regulations affects your daily life. So it's very interesting how that changes here. And I kind of think about this in terms of like HR, human resources. I don't know if you had someone get fired at work because they broke some kind of company policy. And all of a sudden, HR starts educating everyone about it. It's like, all right, guys, you all have to take this class again. You all have to learn about this policy because someone got fired for it. And it's almost kind of what's happening here. Because Nadab and Abihu, there's all this re-education and saying, look, you all have to learn about clean and unclean because this was not being obeyed. And it's not like this was a completely strange concept. It's really interesting when you think about Noah bringing a pair of unclean animal and a pair of unclean and 7 pairs of unclean animals to the ark. So how did Noah know the difference between clean and unclean? Okay. How did Abraham know what to sacrifice? How did Cain and Abel know what to sacrifice? So the whole distinction between clean and unclean was probably not a brand new thing. The Israelites probably knew about it, and God probably taught them at some point because no one knew about it. So I think through generations and after generations living in Egypt, maybe they lost that tradition and that knowledge, and they have neglected it, and now God is trying to re-educate everyone about what that means and how to go about that. So then Leviticus 16 is the Day of Atonement, and that's the day when the tabernacle will be cleansed. And chapter 16 starts with, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew near before the Lord and died. Okay. So even chapter 16 starts with talking about Nadab and Abihu, right? So the entire section from 10 to 16, it all starts with that problem, and the solution is in 16. Now, but in between, God is telling everyone and teaching everyone what the clean and unclean means so you can learn how to approach God. Now, another way to think about this is pure and impure. So clean and unclean is one way to translate it, but another way to translate that Hebrew word is pure and impure. And they also represent order and chaos, normal, abnormal, whole, and deformed. And they also symbolize life and death, right? So when you're following these clean regulations, it's drawing you closer to God, closer to life. And when you're following these unclean things, it's getting you closer to death and sin. This is what Michael Morales, one of the commentators, say about this. Fundamentally, clean or pure is a basic requirement for being in the divine presence as manifested even by the ark in the Holy of Holies, which had been overlaid with pure gold. That word pure is the same word as clean. Okay? Thus, to be clean means to be fit for the presence of God, while to be holy means that one belongs to God. I love the definition. Let's read it one more time. Thus, to be clean means to be fit for the presence of God, while to be holy means that one belongs to God. Okay. Something that is holy must remain exclusively in God's sacred space, living for His will alone, or else be destroyed so as to prevent common or profane usage. And he goes on to talk about uncleanness, how uncleanness is not flatly or immediately equated with particular sinful acts. It is nevertheless treated as being generally or ultimately the result of sin. Okay. Uncleanness represents the pollution of sin. Okay. Contact with the carcass results in uncleanness. Therefore, not because such contact is in itself a sin, but because death and mortality are the result of sin. Precisely here, the correlation between holiness and life, wholeness is critical. Okay. Physical imperfection, disruptions, deformities, and maladies, though not considered sinful in themselves, nevertheless still reflect sin's damage and pollution of the earth, and therefore require ritual cleansing. Okay. Thanks to Mime, we have this really cool sketch here, and it really helps to explain some of these concepts, because they're kind of hard to understand, but when you visualize it, it helps a lot. So you think about how God told Aaron to distinguish between the sacred and the common, right? Or the holy and the common. And you have the sacred space, which is the tabernacle, which is holy. And then you have the common space, which is divided in two parts, the clean and the unclean. Okay? So if you're in the camp, that's clean in the community of other believers, right? But if you're outside the camp in the wilderness, that represents chaos, death, and sin, and is unclean. And as you draw closer to the Lord, you're going closer to life and the presence of God, His holiness. And there are three different states that you can be in under the Old Testament. You can be in an unclean state by breaking these ritual laws, but you can wash and you can have a waiting period, or at times a sacrifice, to become clean. Now you're in a clean state where you can rejoin the camp and the community. But from clean state, you have to make a sacrifice to go into the holy space. Yeah, because remember the burnt offering, where is the burnt offering taking place? It's not at the camp, and it's not inside the tabernacle, it's at the entrance of the tabernacle. So before you enter, you have to make the sacrifice to enter the holy place. And of course, there's the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest can enter. So there's all this like space, and if you profane and pollute, you can become unclean, like we see in chapter 10. So you have this kind of intricate system of how you approach God in this holy space. And I really like this commentator and how he talks about keeping in mind how the tabernacle is an architectural mountain of God and model of the threefold cosmos. The Holy of Holies corresponds to the clouded summit of the mountain, the heavenly abode of God, as a place of God's presence. The Holy of Holies represents the uttermost source of life. At the opposite end of the spectrum is the wilderness, which corresponds to the unruly waters surrounding the mountain, underneath which lies Sheol, the realm of chaos and death. What is clean may be brought into God's presence of the entrance of the tabernacle, the courtyard before the altar. Before drawing near to him, however, the clean person, animal, or object must be sanctified, made holy so as to belong to Yahweh. Broadly, what is unclean lies closer to death and chaos, and what is clean is closer to life of Yahweh. Beyond the status of clean is that of holy, and then most holy, which is nearest to Yahweh, who is absolute life himself. Okay. And this kind of reminds me of the verse in Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy 30, 19 to 20. This day I call heavens and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And of course, in the New Testament, our concept is different. Okay? At baseline, we are sinful and we are at enmity with God. Okay? But because of Christ and his perfect sacrifice, we are sanctified and justified, and we can have fellowship with God. And I don't know about you, but this is much simpler. Okay? This is much easier for me to understand. And I've always wondered, why did God set up this intricate Old Testament covenant? Because it seems very complicated. All this clean, unclean, all these different states. This is so much easier, right? This is so much simpler. But I think one of the commentators said that it's kind of like teaching a child how to use a knife, okay? You don't start with giving a baby a knife and say, here, go use it, right? You first say, no, you can't touch this knife. And eventually when they're ready, you teach them how to use that knife properly and cautiously. So what I'm really saying here is that the Old Testament covenant is kind of like algebra, okay? And this is calculus. So before you can understand this, you have to understand the basic concept. Even though Paul talks about the Old Testament being obsolete, you need that. You need that obsolete DOS programming to get to C++, right? So this is, how can you understand the death of Christ and the sacrifice of Christ? It's hard to understand all that without some of the Old Testament concepts. So God is teaching mankind about holiness, about moral purity, and about approaching God through these different covenants. And this is where we get there. Okay, so now we're going to talk about chapter 11 and how that fits into the bigger picture of the clean and the unclean. So let's dig into the first two verses here. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, speak to the people of Israel, saying, these are the living things that you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. So again, Aaron is kind of being responsible here. For the first time, God's addressing both Moses and Aaron, because I think Aaron is responsible to teach the rest of Israelites what's clean and unclean. And maybe potentially because I think Aaron was responsible for what happened in chapter 10. As the high priest, I think he was ultimately responsible for what happens. And then God goes on to describe all the different kinds of animals that you can and cannot eat that are clean and unclean. And it's divided into different sections, like the mammals, the land animals, the water animal, and then you got the birds, insects, and reptiles. And they're all different reasons why some of them are clean, some of them are not clean, and different requirements. So for example, for the mammals, if they have a divided hoof and they chew the cud, and it's clean. So things like sheep, goats, oxen, all the pastoral shepherding animals the Israelites were used to. But the unclean were the carnivore or animals who did not fit those qualifications. And water animals, obviously, if they have fins and scales, they were clean. But if they didn't have fins or scales, or they were bottom feeders, they were considered unclean. So lobster is out of the question. For birds, if there's a bird of prey or scavengers, like vultures, eagles, any ones that eat the dead, right? They were considered unclean. And everything else was considered clean. So that's chicken, doves, and pigeons. And interestingly, grasshopper was okay. You can eat grasshoppers because they moved in kind of orderly hopping movement versus the insects were like swarming and kind of chaos. So they kind of represented chaos and order. So somehow the insects were bad, but grasshoppers were okay. And all reptiles were unclean. And I think, given that Genesis talks about the snake, it's understandable why they're unclean. And just for fun, I thought I would show you guys a picture of my favorite unclean foods. So you got baby back ribs, you have this amaebi shrimp as a sushi form, you got Peking duck, got bacon, you got lobster, and you got this Korean pork belly. These are some of my favorite unclean food. And it just makes me really grateful that I don't live under the Old Testament law. So there's all these different reasons with this food, but there were these regulations that you can't eat these unclean food, right? And you can't touch the carcass of the unclean food. But you can actually touch them if they're alive. So for example, donkeys and camels were unclean, but you can ride and use them, okay? But if they're dead, you can't touch them and you can't eat them. Now, if any of these insects or animals touch your vessels, or like your cooking utensils or vase or bowls, that becomes unclean and either needs to be washed or destroyed. And the consequence of eating these meat or touching the dead body of these animals meant that you were unclean till evening and that your clothes must be washed. Yeah. So the obvious question is, why these animals? It seems kind of obscure. Why are we talking about these specifically? And there's been a lot of theories, a lot of different commentators. There are books after books written about this. And the common one that I heard growing up was the hygiene, that God was looking out for the health and the hygiene of the Israelites, that these animals can cause infection and different kind of foodborne illnesses. But that doesn't really make sense because they were abolished in New Testament time. And they said, like the cooking practice in the Roman times weren't that much better than the Old Testament. So hygiene doesn't really explain a lot. The cultic kind of explains some things, that some of these food were animals that were sacrificed to idols in other cultures and other cults. But that only explains some, right? Because actually, archaeologically, the other cults and religions also sacrificed the same animals that Israelites did. So it only explains part of the picture. So I think mostly it was symbolic. And I think this explanation was the one that resonated with me the most. That, remember, Israelites culturally were shepherds, right? And the animals that they sacrificed were the animals they shepherded, that they were used to. So those animals already kind of represented their culture and what was comfortable to them, okay? And there were other animals like pigs that were more associated with Philistines. So automatically, some of those animals symbolized other cultures, and these animals symbolized the Israelites. So it was natural for God to distinguish and make distinguishment and saying, you are the people of God, and therefore you eat these type of food. And the other thing about symbolic is that some of the unclean food, they obviously symbolize death, right? So you got the carnivore who are killing things. You got the birds of prey who are either killing other animals or eating dead things, okay? And you have the unclean reptiles that crawl on the belly. So those things kind of make sense why they represent death. And clean kind of represents holy because they are sacrificial animals. So I think largely this was very symbolic. And I think it was all talking about, I think one commentator says this is about driving a wedge between life and death. In every aspect of life, choose life, right? To enter his presence. And that was kind of the overall message that God was trying to teach the Israelites. Okay. Now, what's the purpose? What is the purpose of giving them these laws? And God says in verse 44, okay, for I am the Lord your God, consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You should not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawl on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You should therefore be holy, for I am holy. Okay. So the first purpose here that I see is that God is giving them a new identity as God's people. Okay. Food has a lot to do with your identity. Many cultures are known for their food, right? And we all know who are the vegetarians and vegans, right? Because it's obvious, and they can't really hide it. Because every time you eat with them, they talk about what they eat. Yeah? Well, I mean, not in a bad way, but I mean, it's very obvious, right? Like, we all know who's vegetarian, who's gluten-free, who's non-GMO organic, and all that stuff in California. Because eating is a very intimate part of life, and it really distinguishes you. And when the Israelites have to abstain from these food, it set them apart as a people of God. And it's interesting that from Exodus, they're delivered from slavery, okay? Their identity was slaves, and now their identity is a people of God. Okay. What a change. There's a line from a popular musical. It says, don't forget from whence you came. And I love that because God is kind of reminding the Israelites, don't forget where you come from. Okay? He's reminding them constantly in the book of Leviticus, I delivered you from Egypt. I'm the God who did that. Why is God reminding them so often about getting delivered from Egypt? I mean, in my mind, the Israelites are kind of fresh off the boat, right, for lack of a better word. They just got out of Egypt, and they have to be reminded constantly that they got out of Egypt. And it's not like it happened decades ago, right? And I think it's because we have short-term memory. We often neglect what God has done for us. Our attitude towards God is, what have you done for me lately? Okay? And that was Israel's attitude. And God had to constantly remind them where they came from and what God did for them. Okay? And I think the challenge is, do we feel the same way? Okay? We've been delivered from slavery of sin. And that should be our motivation for obedience and for our consecration. But I think we often forget that. When's the last time you got saved? Maybe many years ago. Is the joy of your salvation something that you don't remember anymore? Right? Restore to me the joy of your salvation, right? And embracing our identity as the people of God. Second purpose is that it was a lesson of holiness and moral purity. Okay? Each time they avoided this unclean food, it was a reminder that they were doing so because God is holy. Therefore, I'm abstaining from this food. Okay? It was a reminder of God's holiness, and it reminded them to pursue moral purity just as we're pursuing ritual cleanness. And I think we often think about Leviticus as just random, obscure rules, but that's not true at all, right? And the common view that the God of the Old Testament was angry and giving you a bunch of laws. And that's such a childish understanding of the law, right? And that's what the child thinks when the parent says, you can't do that, because I said so. And child thinks, well, my dad's being mean, and he's just giving me a bunch of rules, and I don't want to follow these rules. Right? And that's kind of what the world says about the Old Testament and about Leviticus. But that's not the heart of God in Leviticus, is it? Okay. You see the heart of God in verse 26:12. I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. Okay. God is giving them these laws to help them draw closer to him, to teach them moral purity and holiness so that he can walk amongst them. Okay. And it's the same heart of God that died on the cross for us. And lastly, the last purpose here I see is consecration. It says, for I am the Lord your God, consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And the word consecration is great because it means to make or declare holy or sacred. Okay? In another word, consecrate means to set apart as holy, belonging to the Lord. From food to every aspect of your life, every aspect of your body, in terms of the clean and unclean rules, they were to consecrate their body as holy unto the Lord. Does that not remind you of Romans 12:1? Right? Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual act of worship. So the Old Testament laws don't apply to us, but the principle remains. Okay? So we don't have to follow these rules, and we don't have to abstain from bacon. Okay? But the principle here is consecration. Is that you dedicate your life, you set your life apart to belong to the Lord. Okay? What are some of the areas in our life that we must consecrate unto the Lord? What are the areas that we're holding back? I heard this podcast about a writer who was writing a book about how there's all these Christians who are dying and giving up their life for Christ in the Middle East. And here in America, we're struggling to give up Netflix for Lent, right? We are so comfortable in our middle-class life in America that we have to question ourselves, where in our life do we need to consecrate and set apart as belonging to the Lord? What am I holding back from God? Because it all belongs to God. Okay. And lastly, the reason why we don't have to follow these rules is because Christ has cleansed us, right? He has sanctified us to make us holy. Okay? Sanctified means to declare clean, to make clean. Okay? And it is Christ who makes us clean, that we don't have to remain in the unclean state. And this made me think about a story that my friend told me about a patient on Mercy Ship. And Mercy Ship is a Christian organization where they turned the boat into a portable surgical hospital. Okay? And they go to West Africa, and every year they go to a different country in West Africa to perform specialty surgery that these countries cannot perform. Things like cleft lips, a lot of specialty surgeries that's just not provided there. And this particular lady had obstetric fistula, okay? And it's a complication from childbirth where basically you have a hole in your bladder and you're just leaking urine, okay? And there was no surgical solution for that in her country. So she had this for 20 years, okay? Now, what would happen to these women typically is that they would be an outcast from the community because they smell like urine. And in West Africa, where they practice polygamy, their husbands often abandon them and divorce them. Okay? So they're abandoned by their family, they're considered outcasts by community, and they smell of urine, and they can't even go out in public. And it's like the most modern day example of uncleanness. And this patient finally had surgery after 20 years, and she was so joyful to rejoin the community of other people. And this made me think about Luke chapter 8, about the bleeding woman, how this woman was bleeding for 12 years, and she spent all of her life savings going to doctor after doctor, trying to heal herself from this bleeding, and she couldn't get rid of it. Okay? And she was unclean for those 12 years. She was an outcast. Think about living with that shame, being abandoned by her family, being an outcast for 12 years. And when she sees Jesus, she probably disguises herself just to get close to him, okay? Because she's unclean. She can't be in that crowd of people when they're all pressing on him, okay? And she just wanted a piece of his garment because she didn't want to make him unclean. She didn't even dare touch Jesus. She just wanted the corner of his garment. And she sneaked behind him just to touch his garment. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" Can you imagine the amount of courage it took for her to say that was me? The Bible says she came trembling. She came trembling in fear and shame and confessed that it was her. And you know that the whole crowd was thinking, well, what if I touched her? She may have made me unclean, right? And she was probably thinking that Jesus was going to be angry and react in anger. But what did Jesus say? He says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." He declares her clean right there and then. He heals her, sanctifies her, and gives her a new identity as a child of God. What can wash away my sin? What can make me whole again? What can wash us pure as snow? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your work on the cross. Thank you that you have made us clean, that you have sanctified us and declared us clean. Something that we can never do on our own, Father, that we deserve to be in our sin and shame, but you have delivered us from that by your cross and by what you have done. Thank you, Jesus, for who you are and who you are to us. Help us to consecrate our lives unto you. In every aspect of our life, from the eating to our body, to the way we handle ourselves, the way we meet other people in relationships. Help us to honor you and consecrate and set apart for your purpose. In Christ I pray, amen.